Conversations.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Strong Conversations, Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. As usual, it is me, your host, Carolyn Strong. As a lot of you know, I have been out of commission because I got injured, had to have, the $6 million bionic ankle situation happening, still recovering from that. But kind of giving everything that is going on in the world right now, I had to kind of pull myself together, quite literally, and have this conversation with the always wonderful, always gracious Dr. Tiffany, just talking about how to talk to our children about yet another incident of racialized violence. Welcome, Dr. Tiffin. As you know, you are the you expert. So for those of us that have been living under a rock, tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Tiffany Dent. I am a licensed psychologist. I call myself a psychologist for the culture because I center the needs of Black folks in the work that I do.
Awesome. So I wanted to have this strong conversation today because I've been seeing just some things out there with parents and teachers that just don't know what to do anymore. Most recently, I do want to take a moment to kind of hold space and send condolences to the family of Tyree Nichols, who was the most recent unfortunate victim of racialized violence at the hands of law enforcement in this country. So my heart does go out to his family and to his loved ones and those that have had to bear witness to those things. But in that, because of technology and how technology has been proliferated over the years, now everyone bears witness to these things. And it does impact us whether we know it does or not. And these are things that children are also witnessing. So one of the questions that's been coming up and that I've kind of been seeing out there is, how do we have these conversations with children? So I am an educator. I am not a mental health expert. And y'all know I'm gonna stay in my lane always. So when we start talking about questions about mental health, I'm gonna step aside and I'm gonna let experts in to have those conversations. So I do just kind of want to ask some questions for the parents out there, for the teachers out there, just to talk about how we safely have healthy conversations, because our goal is always to do no harm. And I know sometimes in the interest of trying to do right, we don't always get it right. So I just want to put us in the best position to get it right. So I guess what I want to start off saying is that, there was a time in the past where with like Rodney King, that was just one incident of racialized violence at the hands of law enforcement that just happened to be recorded because somebody just happened to have a camcorder with film in it and it was charged. It just, all those things just happened to line up for the world to bear incident to that incident, or to bear witness to that incident. And when you were talking to people about it, it was that whole bad apple thing. Well, this is just one incident and it was just bad apples. But now it's almost like clockwork. Several times a year, if not sometimes several times a month, we are seeing these incidents. So we can no longer just explain this away as bad apples or one-offs. So I guess this is why these conversations become so important. How do we now begin to approach this, since that's just over there, that is no longer an option?
And first, I want to say, I know that some people are going to try to say this last incident was not racialized violence because of the color of the officers who were primarily involved. However, when we're talking about racialized violence, it's the idea of that this racial group is
Mm-hmm.
experiencing this because of their race, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in that, it doesn't matter the color of the law enforcement officers. It's the system that makes it more acceptable, or the belief that it's acceptable to do this to one community over the other. That this is something that what is believed to be allowed to happen because it's happening to Black or brown people, and that it's viewed as justifiable or acceptable. So we want to kind of make sure that we're clear on that. As it relates to beginning to have this conversation, the difficulty has been that society doesn't want to acknowledge that this happens. There is this investment in denying racism and denying systemic racism and denying that institutions, some of them were established for the purpose of oppressing communities of color. And so we've been able to get away from having this conversation for so long because we don't want to have the conversation. We don't want to acknowledge it. It took one school shooting for schools to put a whole system in place, curricula in place to talk about how do you deal with school shootings, to plan for what do students do when it happens. Here's how parents should have these conversations. And then those get brought up every time a school shooting unfortunately happens, because society wants to say that that is something that just is not justifiable. And so when you put a spotlight on racialized violence, we have to begin to have this conversation about racism and how it shows up for Black children, and how that results in vicarious racial trauma and stress. Because when our children are looking at these, they realize that this is how society sees me, that society justifies killing people who look like me, and I have to justify existing. That it's not enough that I'm a kid and I should be allowed to be a kid. I have to prove that I'm a kid that deserves not to be murdered. And so just even coming from that and knowing that this is something that can happen to me, because this is when we're looking at these are various situations. We have people sleeping in their beds in their homes, right? We have people coming from the grocery store, in terms of racialized violence, getting Skittles. We have a kid playing in the park in Cleveland, Ohio. We have people selling loose cigarettes. We have people at traffic stops, things that are so
Well-being checks.
well-being checks, right? We have people who are either doing minimally wrong things that don't result in death, or just living their lives. And this still, then we hear this outcry from society telling our children that their lives do not matter. And so I think the first thing is that we have to not continue to act like it doesn't happen. We think that we are protecting our children when we don't talk about things. But instead, when we don't talk, we make it seem like it's acceptable or it's not important. So when our children are sitting here with all these feelings and fears, that first we need to acknowledge that they're seeing it on TV. If they're on social media, people are posting about it. They're hearing about it in schools and in the streets. If you even turn on the radio, they're replaying the videos, the audio from the
Oh
video, so
wow,
the
I didn't
children
know
cannot.
that.
Yes, I was listening to the news and they were playing the audio.
Oh
So
wow.
even if you're saying, I don't want to watch this, I don't want to be exposed to this, it's showing up. And
Can we
so the
just
first,
can I just put a pin in that for just
yes,
one
absolutely.
second? Because there's also some divide about watching it, and you did an
Mhm,
awesome op-ed situation about that.
mhm.
And I do kind of want to just say, if you don't want to watch it, that's okay.
Mhm.
And you don't have to.
Mm.
So
And my thing is, for children, I don't recommend it, because sometimes we do one extreme or the other. We have
mhm.
parents who say, I'm going to have my child totally avoided. And when we have the child totally avoided, even though the world around them is talking about it, it makes it appear as if it's either not important, their feelings are not valid, or it's justifiable, because we're leaving our kids to figure out why it's not being talked about in home. Or we go to the other extreme and we show it to them. So we expose them to trauma purposely and as a lesson. And my thing is always, as specifically Black people, we know these things happen. We don't have to watch them to prove that they happen. And when we hear the emotions that are occurring, it's I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm helpless, I'm traumatized, I'm anxious, I'm fearful, all of these things. And do we purposely want normally choose to expose our children to things that we know are going to make them fearful, anxious, feel helpless? We usually choose not to.
I was
If
going
we
to
can
say,
help
no
it.
one runs around going, come here and lick this lead wall.
Right. And so we know that our kids may be exposed to it, but sitting them in front of the screen and saying, hey, I need you to watch this so you know what trauma, what racialized violence looks like. We can have the conversations and say, what have you heard? Have you heard about this? Or even beginning, if they haven't, say, well, let me tell you what's happening, and say it in age appropriate language, and then ask them, do they have questions? How do they feel about that? What does that bring up for them as a Black child? And we want to do it in that way.
So what, in this case, what would age appropriate language look
Mhm.
like? So if I'm talking, because for somebody like me who's having a conversation with
Mhm.
a grown adult 21-year-old about this
Mhm.
and a 7-year-old. So yeah.
I
Um,
know every time.
so let's say that we're in that littles space,
Mhm.
that third and under, or even
Mhm.
four. Would four be considered littles? For this
Mhm.
example, we're going to say fourth grade and under.
Okay.
What does appropriate language, and when you're talking about something like this, look and sound like?
And I think I would say, ask them, have you heard about what happened to the Black man in Memphis that was killed by police? And if they're like, oh, yeah, I heard about it, you ask them, what did they hear? And so that would guide your language. If they said they didn't, you would say, well, you may hear about this. We've talked before about sometimes people, adults, who are supposed to keep us safe choose not to keep us safe. And instead, they choose to hurt us. And sometimes that seems to happen more because of what we look like, because some people don't seem to think that we matter as much as other people. And so there was another incident of someone being killed by police when he was driving for at a traffic stop. And so you may hear about that, and that those police officers have been arrested at this point in time, and we're just waiting to see what happens next. But you
Okay.
often will ask the children, because sometimes they'll tell you when you say, have you heard about this? Oh, yeah, because they're in playgrounds, they're listening adults. And, one of the things is sometimes, adults around them, we forget that the kids are there. They're supposed to be in nap time, they're supposed to be coloring, they're supposed to be working on something. And we start watching and talking about, and they're listening. So I always want to ask them, what have you heard? And then I ask them if they have any questions. And usually those questions come up with, why do people do this to us? The questions are, is this going to happen to me? Um, are they going to be in trouble for this? So you want to be able to honestly answer the questions. Um, because sometimes we want to, and you just do it matter of factly, because sometimes we want to go into these, you just matter of factly. So if someone says, why do they do this to us? I don't know. Sometimes people seem to think that they can do things to Black people that they can't do to everybody else. And that's sad, because that's not right. Um, are they going to get in trouble? Right now, they've been arrested, but we don't know what's going to happen because they have to go to court. Is this going to happen to me? I hope not. And I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe. But we also know that everybody who's there to keep you safe is not always going to keep you safe. And so we need to talk about what that's going to look like. And how would you know?
Now, that's definitely the conversation for the parents to have.
Mhm.
Is there a space for teachers to have these conversations? And what does slash should that space look like?
I think it depends on what state you're in, right? Because
Oh, right.
in
Okay.
some states you can't mention Black
Good point.
history. You can't
Right.
mention anything that has to do with Black people. So it depends on the state you're in. Um,
In the states where it's still legal to have those
to have
conversations.
conversations, to have books in your classroom. I think one of the things would be when the students come in, doing a check-in and seeing how they're feeling, because in asking them, have they been hearing what's been happening in the news, and just kind of doing a feeling check in with them, and talking about, depending upon the age of the children, you want to talk about safety and that everybody deserves to be safe. That's, and acknowledge that sometimes when people are supposed to be the ones who keep you safe, they don't. And that's a problem. But acknowledging their fear and making space for it to be okay to be anxious and to try to calm some of those fears within that classroom. I think the struggle is in the current environment for educators having really authentic conversations when students are talking about issues of systemic racism and police brutality may get you fired.
I was going to
Um,
say, you got to choose between walking in your truth and feeding your family.
Absolutely. And so I think, the thing is that, and depending upon the age of the students, you may have students talk about that, feeling helpless and feeling like police officers get away with killing them. And in those situations, you talk about that all children should have the right to live and feel safe and feel that those who are there to protect them really do protect them. And when that doesn't happen, that is never okay. And I think that's that space that educators can exist in and keep their jobs.
And that piece notwithstanding, what advice do you have for allies in the classroom? Because I don't, I, if you're coming into my classroom and I am your teacher and you feel this way, do I not address it because I don't look like you? Do
Mhm.
I do I just kind of hold space and open up the floor for you to kind of express how you feel to me and to each other, and I just kind of tacitly step back? Like, what does that look like?
I think the struggle is that there is this often sometimes inclination to go into few bad apples, not everyone, and come from this place of your interactions with others and the privilege of being who you are and inhabiting the body that you do. And so when people are saying, we hold on to the wrong words when students start talking about always or they never, those absolutes. Allies at times want to jump in and say, well, not always. Well, sometimes they are okay. And that is not the space for that, because students, even when they're using absolutes, they know that there are exceptions to the rule. They don't need you to point that out in that moment. And then you have to figure out that place of privilege that you're coming from, that's not been your experience. And one, especially when they go into issues, especially if you're in classrooms with teaching primarily Black and Brown children, you want to separate yourself from the harm doers. And so, are you doing that for them, or are you doing it to make yourself feel better? And so, I think part of it is acknowledging that and asking, I know there's been a lot of stuff in the news that's been happening, and especially just like we do when school shootings happen. We have those conversations, right? We have the conversations that we want to, but being able to say, I know that there's been a lot happening, and that things have happened in Memphis. How many of you have heard about it? And how are you? And giving them the room to just talk about it and not feeling the need to interrupt. Now, you can always, within classrooms, if and say, well, but let's set some guidelines. Like, we ain't gonna use cuss words. We ain't going to, whatever the guidelines are, try to set them up at the beginning, because what you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to do is start jumping in and policing their language as they go along, because then
Yeah,
you're missing the point.
yeah.
And then you want to make space for it. Never say you understand, because sometimes we say, I get it, I understand. It's okay to not uh, have that experience and to acknowledge that you don't, to not make excuses. We love to throw in, well, not all, there's only a few bad apples. Well, look, this time they arrested them, which most of us are saying, yes, because they were Black, white, and
Because
blue.
they were Black, yeah.
And so trying not to say, well, things are better now or whatever, but letting them have that space to have the conversation and saying, are you going to do to take care of yourself? These things are happening. What are some of the things that you students are doing to try to get through this? Because if if you exist in a space where this is where we're talking about Tamir Rice, when we're talking about Breonna Taylor, when we're talking about George Floyd, and now we're talking about Tyree Nichols, like we're talking about this and we're talking about this and we're talking about this, what are you doing to take care of yourself? Because this has got to be a lot. And so part of it is just being able to identify what the children are doing with those feelings. Um, I also am not a fan of insisting that they peacefully protest. We want to also police that. So we want to jump into telling them how they're supposed to manage it versus what is a way that you are addressing this that is good for you, that's not going to be more harmful for you, because it's sometimes, especially with our lack of emotional maturity, because they're children, it's not always that thinking it all the way through, but helping them to identify that there is something that you need to do with these feelings to be okay in a society that's not okay for you right now.
Okay. I have one more question and it uh, flew away, but I think that kind of covers it.
Mhm,
Here it is. It's back. What school districts, just again, from an educator perspective,
mhm,
I've made my stance on what the silence says known
mhm,
very, very clearly. But
mhm.
from a mental health perspective, which is not the same, what does that silence say?
The silence says your feelings don't matter. The silence says your reality is not reality. The silence says that this is not a big deal. The silence says get over yourself. The silence says we don't care about you or your experiences. And that's what silence says to these children. And we do that on the things that we don't want to deal with. There are issues that happen within. We weren't silent on Ukraine. We were not silent on school shootings. We are not silent on elections. We're not silent on a whole bunch of stuff, but we are silent on this because we don't want to deal with it. And sometimes it's the silence is those reasons. Other times is we don't know what to do. And for educators in this current climate, it's also this understanding that you are working within systems, that when you're talking about issues of equity, when you're talking about issues of systemic racism, that you're running the risk of not being able to educate the children ever again. And so that makes it a very hard situation for everyone to be in, and unfair to children who are experiencing vicarious racial stress and trauma at this point in time again.
Yeah, once again. So, in closing, if there were three strategies, techniques, tips that you would want to leave people with in facilitating these conversations with young
Mhm.
people, what would those three things be?
One, facilitate the conversation is the first
Okay.
one. Don't not have the conversation. Two, take the lead from what the students are saying, that they are feeling and that they're experiencing in this moment. And then three, make a point to assist them in identifying how they are taking care of themselves in while they're experiencing all of this trauma and stress.
Thank you. Tell the people how to find you.
I am Dr. Tiffany. You can reach me on all social media at Dr. Tiffany, DrTyffani. That is Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and I'm even on TikTok for my
I
daughters.
forget you're on
I
TikTok.
don't do much for my daughters.
I forget that you were on TikTok. I've been trying to
Mhm.
venture over there, but it's just so many buttons, so many buttons.
Yes, it is.
I opened it up once and I was like, all the buttons, and I just kind of backed out of it.
I'm with
But
you.
you are Dr. Tiffany across all
I
platforms,
am.
and I thank you for having this conversation with me. And again, I thank you all for joining us in this strong conversation, unpacking racialized violence with children. Um, I will be back again when the bionic ankle finishes becoming bionic and great, but I had to do this. There was no way that I was not going to do this. So, with that being said, y'all have a good one. And until next time.